I suspect that that cycle has ended and that we're going to go into 6 to 9 months of falling equity and commodity markets. I think that when the revised employment data comes out, people are going to be shocked. What is clear is that for the last 10 odd years, quietly, China has been preparing for global conflict, rebuilding the PLA. In the last couple of years, just in the last week or so, Taiwan is saying, we have never seen such a large fleet of naval vessels surrounding us since 1996, that on our reckoning, by 2028, we will be at war. That's when World War III starts.
Hello and welcome back to Soar Financially. My name is Kai Hoffmann. I'm the EdJR mining guy over on X, and of course, your host of this channel. And I'm really looking forward to my guest today. It's Simon Hunt. He's the CEO of Simon Hunt Strategic Services, somebody I tremendously enjoy talking with because I learned a lot. Conversation today is going to be very heavy on geopolitics, and we're trying to mix in the economics as well, because they're intertwined. There's so much going on in the world right now that we need to understand. So many moves happening in the Middle East, for example, Russia, Ukraine. We had Putin's press conference yesterday, and some softer tones I picked up. So I'm curious where things are heading in 2025. This conversation is part of our Outlook 2025 series, so we'll recap 2024 a little bit, and then dare looking out and looking forward to 2025. We have a new U.S. president moving into the White House on January 20th. We'll see how much change he can bring and how much will happen in the first 2 years. As he promised, that seems to be the guideline or timeline for change in the U.S. So we'll see, and I'm really curious to hear from Simon on that. Before I switch over, free way to support our channel is just by hitting that like and subscribe button. I know 75 to 80% of you are not subscribed. Just subscribe. It helps us out tremendously. We do appreciate it. Now, Simon, I'm like a little kid at a candy store. I'm really excited to be chatting with you and appreciate you making the time here right before Christmas. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, we're looking forward to this. As I said, I learned so much chatting and listening to you, Simon. And maybe we'll start with a bit of I don't know, let's call it an opening question, not an icebreaker. But 2024, we're almost done. What is it, December 20th as we were recording this? Like, what was an aha moment for you last year, the last 12 months? Something that was like, oh, I didn't see that one coming.
I didn't see the strength of equity markets continuing until a few days ago.
Oh, okay. That opens a whole can of worms, Simon. We'll need to get to that. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Okay. Like I wanted to start geopolitics. Now you started with the markets. Now my head is spinning already, and we're barely done with question one, Simon. Okay. Let's unpack that. Let me ask a why question. So why were the equity markets so strong? Maybe we'll start there.
Liquidity, a sense in the investment community of the strength of the US economy. I think it's a similar sort of trend that you get towards the end of a cycle. I suspect that that cycle has ended and that we're going to go into 6 to 9 months of falling equity and commodity markets. I think that when the revised employment data comes out, people are going to be shocked that actually employment fell last year. When you look at retail sales in nominal numbers last year, up to the first 11 months, they rose by 2.4%. But what did CPI do? Rose by 3%. So even taking CPI, then you had negative retail sales last year. The problem is that CPI is thoroughly manipulated. You talk to any household, the wife who does the weekly or the monthly shopping will tell you inflation is very much higher than that. If you use the unmanipulated data, going back to the 1970s that John Williams of Shadow Government Stats does. Inflation this year so far has averaged 10.8%. So, I mean, even saying that the figure is 5%, that's a pretty big drop on retail sales. And we'll probably see retail sales in the early months of next year being revised down. So there are all sorts of complications to the economic data. But I think there is two other matters that we need to address. The first is that the revisions in the employment data will be produced by the BLS in February, and that is bound to show a very sharp revision downwards. And since the Philly Fed does a regular assessment of the employment data themselves, and not so long ago, they came out with a revised figure for the year ending March this year. And when the BLS revised their data, it was absolutely smack on, 800,000 down. They are now saying for the second quarter that employment fell, whereas the BLS is saying rose by 1.1%. So the economic chips that we will see in the first 6 to 9 months of next year are not going to be good. But there is another element, and an important one, which is that, I'm just getting my notes, which is that there's probably going to be a deliberate policy by the Trump government to take a lot of the fat out of the economy in order to have a sounder base from which they can grow the economy and grow prosperity. For instance, Elon Musk on the 29th of October said, "We have to reduce spending to live within our means, and that necessarily involves some temporary hardship, but will ensure long-term prosperity." So we've got to have a solid base before we can produce the better things for everybody. So on our cycle work, we will see a weak global economy in the first 6 to 9 months of next year, by when the fiscal and monetary stimuli, which Trump and others will introduce, will start a 2-year boom in equities, in business activity, and in commodity markets. But the problem is that it will be accompanied by rising inflation. And what we see as we go through 2027 and into 2028, we will see a repeat of the inflation process that we experienced in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And what does that imply? If US CPI is around 13% and global inflation around 15%, what are long-term bonds going to yield? US 10-year treasuries will be yielding over 10%. What is that going to do to a highly leveraged debt system? It's going to be the end of this particular cycle, and we go into rolling recessions or even depression. So how does the frictions or the wars being seen in Europe and the Middle East, how do they fit into the scenario? It's very possible that the Trump administration, who don't want wars, will do what they can to prevent the wars from escalating. So let's start with what's going on in Europe.
Simon, can I briefly interrupt you before we get to
Yeah, yeah, sure,
geopolitics?
sure, sure, sure,
Just before
sure.
we get to geopolitics, because that I've got so many questions about geopolitics. I just don't want to get too far away from the economics and the economy that you've touched on, because you mentioned last week was sort of a trigger. Like the markets were strong until last week. What did you mean by? I just want to follow up on that and get some clarity on that. What did you see in the market? What changed?
What changed was the hawkish tone that Powell introduced in his Q&A session. And it started, the markets have been overbought, overvalued. It only needed a small trigger, and that was the trigger. And I think this is what will come from that trigger will be over the 6 to 9 months, so not day to day, but over the next 6 to 9 months, you'll see, for instance, the S&P falling by about 20%, the FANGs by about 40%, and that then lays the foundations for the next big move up, which will take us into 2027, and then we see the collapse.
Okay. No, like no, I was curious because I keep wondering why the market expected a rate cut, telling like after Powell's telling everybody that they're data dependent, right? And he did cut, but the question is like,
What
what is he
data?
seeing? Like there's obviously something that made him nervous, and
Well,
it
it's I I mean, what we have seen has only been the low hanging fruit that have gone into failures or bankruptcies. For the bigger fruit, it takes longer for them to fail because they have other options, other funding options. It's only when those funding options are exhausted do they fail. And it's maybe that's what he's seeing in the undergrowth of the financial system.
one thing he mentioned that surprised me a little bit because he kept using the word data dependency in the past. Now he said, "Oh, we have committees and maybe subcommittees that are looking at future policy scenarios," which surprised me a little bit that he's taken that into account because he never admitted to anything like that. I think we might have talked about that as well. Like, is Powell taking geopolitics into account? Like, what is happening outside of the U.S.? Is he taking that into account for his for the Fed funds rate? And he was never clear on it. He always said data dependent. We'll use, as he said, the jobs data. We'll use the PCE numbers, and we'll base it on that. But now he seems to be forward looking and trying to be proactive about things, talking about tariffs and inflation, for example, based on what the new or the president elect might do come January 20th. I was a bit surprised to hear that. Were you as well?
I think he's become more realistic. There is a new administration coming in with a new guy. He's expressed a lot of measures he's going to introduce, and tariffs. What do tariffs do? Tariffs do two things. They're inflationary, and at the same time, because they're inflationary, they are they take money away out of the pockets of the average household. So it's a very confusing picture. Hence, why I quoted Elon Musk, who obviously has a big influence on policy, why I quoted him, because they understand we can only grow prosperity by taking a lot of the silly stuff out of the system first. So that's why first half next year, first 9 months next year are going to be tough. Markets falling, economic weakness. Europe is not in a good place. Japan is hardly in a good place. China is actually in a better place, but their recovery won't start until the second half of the year.
You were just going to start on Europe and like how the geopolitics are intertwined with the economies now, and I interrupted you. rudely. So maybe
No
we'll
problem.
take maybe we'll take it there. So what are the ramifications now looking forward for next year? Like what is let's call it the butterfly effect. What is happening in the U.S. is reflecting into the European Union, and what you mentioned just now, where I cut you off.
Well, quite clearly, Trump wants a ceasefire. I think by the time we get into by the end of January, Russia will have good control over Ukraine. This morning, they launched a massive attack on Kiev, focusing on the command and control bunkers, in which there were also probably NATO officers. The early indications I've only just seen on RT News is they were completely demolished. They have demolished more than two-thirds of Ukraine's power distribution and generating capacity. So it's going to be a very cold winter. Putin has said that at his Q&A session yesterday that he wants peace, but peace on his terms. And I think this is going to be a big sticking point because his biggest fear is the security of Russia. And that will be the real difficult issues in negotiating with Washington. Because in a couple of years' time, America will have gained hypersonic technology or the equivalent, and therefore drawing a boundary along the Dnieper River is not going to give Russia's radar systems enough warning. He needs control over the whole of Ukraine so that he has enough warning of any impending missile attack by the West. Moreover, no matter who is in the White House, he is completely distrustful of any piece of paper that is written by NATO/Washington. He does not want any NATO troops patrolling Ukraine. So my conclusion is, yes, we get a quick ceasefire, but the negotiations over Ukraine are going to be very protracted. And it's not just going to be Ukraine itself. As Putin says, it's Ukraine's position in Eurasia. So he's looking at a much bigger picture than Ukraine itself. I think there's something else one needs to think of carefully, and that is that the powers behind the throne in Washington are desperate to see that their decades-long objectives of dismembering Russia to gain control of its natural resources can be thrown asunder by Trump. So they are going to do anything they can to see that by the time Trump gets into the White House, he has a big war on his hands. So I throw that out because it's not going to be an easy way from one government to another government in relation to foreign policy.
Maybe just to follow up on that topic, like I've been reading some reports. Like yesterday, Trump said, or actually this morning, news broke here in Germany that Trump wants the EU to buy more oil and gas from the US, actually threatening more tariffs. But then I'm also reading about Vladimir Putin and Zelensky trying to negotiate. I don't think there's actually any conversation happening. The transit deal for Russian gas into the EU through the Ukraine. Like, how is that? Like I'm always looking for motivation and leverage. Like I'm trying to understand why are things happening. And you mentioned the natural resources, so it's like I'm looking at that gas pipeline deal, for example. I'm trying to like sort of put a framework around it. A, what's the motivation, and B, like what kind of leverage does Trump even have? like, or the US even have on Russia to negotiate a peace deal, if that makes sense. Like I'm trying to understand that a little bit, the background here.
Well, I think on the gas side, Trump wants to sell even more gas to Europe. America is the biggest supplier of gas to Europe. I can't remember the exact figure, but there was a huge increase in gas supplies to Europe last year and this year. So he's going to discourage any reopening of those gas pipelines into Europe. So what was the other question?
No, and leverage as well. Like when you enter a negotiation, you got to have some leverage or something to offer or take away, as well. Like
Well,
why would Putin even negotiate, and B, why would Trump negotiate? Like I'm trying to just understand the mindsets a little bit and how people can achieve their goals. Like peace in the
well,
Ukraine is great, but you have to offer something, right? Uh,
peace will only be possible if there is a legitimate government in Ukraine through which Russia can negotiate. There's no legitimate government at the moment. Zelensky is not a legitimate president. He can't sign any piece of paper. So I think what Putin was saying in the Q&A session, I can only negotiate with Ukraine's parliament, the head of Ukraine's parliament, and he has to be confirmed, and his party has to be confirmed in an election. So it's not just Trump and Putin, it's Ukraine itself.
no,
Another reason why this is going to be a very protracted negotiation. And then there are people who want to push for not for peace, but for war. Then we need to look at another aspect of it. Follow the money. Who now owns a large part of Ukraine's farming land? Through granting mortgages, it's the mega financial institutions in America. Who wants the reconstruction contracts? America. And will Russia want that to happen? I doubt it. So all I'm saying is just the more you dig into peace and negotiations, the more complex the issue becomes. So the bottom line is we can have a ceasefire, but the ceasefire will be very much on Putin's terms, because again, as he said in the Q&A yesterday, I don't want a ceasefire that provides Ukraine the time to refurbish its forces.
yeah, I just pulled up the article that sort of summarizes maybe a little bit what Putin says. Like Putin says Russia is ready to compromise with Trump on Ukraine. That sort of reflects on what you've been mentioning. It surprised me a little bit reading it this morning. A softer stance, like I mentioned to you before, on the issue. Softer, maybe not the right word, but at least a willing, yeah, as to compromise. The question is, what does that compromise really look like? As you said, a
Well,
line along the river doesn't make any sense.
well,
So, what does a compromise really look like if there's only really one solution?
yeah. And who are you going to negotiate with? I mean,
Yeah.
the other matters are denazification, demilitarization. I want my $300 billion back plus interest. I mean, all very, these are not things that can be negotiated overnight.
It's just not one phone call, is it?
No, 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 no.
Maybe to expand on that whole topic, like, and I can't get away thinking about it, is what's happening in Syria right now. The U.S. has troops there. Russia has troops and port facilities there. So I'm trying to figure out how that factors in the whole process that we just talked about, the Russian-Ukraine situation. Is that a factor, or is that a completely different topic that
No,
accidentally?
it's all connected.
Hmm.
I mean, who who trained the terrorist groups in northern Syria? Ukrainian special forces. Who trained them with drones? Ukrainian special forces. probably some of the funds that went to Ukraine went into these guys. So Syria is in a state of flux. What's going to emerge? Who knows, really? Russia says we are talking with everybody. The obvious winners are Israel and Turkey. Israel is doing to Syria and Lebanon what they've done to Gaza. Turkey is the wild card. And I saw this morning on the news, again, RT News, that Turkey has amassed a large army on the borders of Syria. I think you've got to look at what Erdogan wants. His popularity has fallen sharply in Turkey. The Turkish economy is quite weak. He needs an external victory. Aleppo is his victory. The province of Aleppo was part of the Ottoman Empire. When Aleppo was overtaken, the first flag to be raised was the Turkish flag. So you've got America and Israel pushing for basically greater Israel. You've got Turkey looking to defeat the Kurds. That has been his long ambition to do. You've got Iran and Russia who deliberately stepped back when they saw that the country was going to collapse. Russia is talking with HTS on their air and port bases. Russia is removing a lot of their assets in Syria to Libya. Whether that's a permanent or a temporary move will depend on what happens in Syria. But I think we have to look at what is Netanyahu looking at. In his mind, not necessarily correct. He's beaten, he's taken over Gaza. He is about to annex part of the West Bank. In his mind, he's defeated Hezbollah. Now, having taken over Syria and now having the ability to use the Syrian airbase, is looking at attacking Iran, which has always been his goal. And there is one scenario that is produced by knowledgeable people that he will make another attack on Iran. Iran will retaliate with a view to destroy and not to send a message. And in so doing, that will force America to come in to support Israel. There is another scenario being painted at the moment that there will be a two-state Palestine state in Gaza and the West Bank, which will bring Saudi into the equation, and thus America will rebuild its old policy of a two-state solution with Saudi Arabia in it, and Saudi Arabia being given the nuclear umbrella. That isolates Iran. But the Iran-Saudi relationships are getting stronger and stronger. They are currently undertaking joint naval exercises. There is a general feeling in the region that we don't want the colonial empires messing around in our region. We are now mature enough to look after ourselves. Then on the other side, you've got Iran and China. Russia and China. China has huge investments in Iran and a 25-year development treaty. China gets a lot of its oil from Iran. Russia is about to sign a very large and complex treaty with Iran, which includes defense. Both countries see Iran as pivotal in developing uh, the BRICS, not just the BRICS organization, but the whole of the transport north-south links and east-west. So Iran is very pivotal to BRICS. Now, one of Trump's objectives is to break up BRICS, and he will probably, in his negotiations with Russia, will say something like, and I'm guessing, we give you Ukraine. We promise that Ukraine will never join NATO, but in return, you've got to break away your alliance with China. So he goes to China. Again, I'm guessing. And he says, you break away from Russia, and if you invade Taiwan, we won't stop you or try to. He has already, or it's not he, Washington has already has had some success in weakening Brazil's resolve with BRICS. The big ministries in Brazil are anti BRICS. So that's put the President Lulu on a weak footing. Moreover, so some suggest all Washington has to do is to make a telephone call and Lula is back in jail. So Washington has already started to break the BRICS organization up. And the reason is very simple, that if BRICS was allowed to mature to the extent that they had developed strong secretariats, enlarged the new development bank into a functioning lending institution, and if first they were able to settle most of their trade and investment without using the dollar, which is on the way of them so doing, and then in a few years' time to form their own BRICS currency, then that would leave America as another failed empire. So a primary objective of Washington, whoever is in the White House, is to see that BRICS fails. What does this mean? First of all, BRICS are not going to disappear tomorrow. So eventually, what it will mean is you've got two strong antagonists, and neither is going to step back. So you end in war. So I, my fear is that the war syndrome, no matter whether in the short term there is ceasefire or deflating the conflict, that on our reckoning, by 2028, we will be at war. That's when World War III starts.
Gloomy, scary, quite honestly. Lot to digest here, and I have a few follow-up questions.
Which to come back to how I started, that's why we have these three short-term cycles until we get into 2028, when then we enter rolling recessions, if not depression, and it's wartime.
Well, that's exactly what Mark Rutte is already saying. He's a new head of NATO. It's time to develop a wartime mindset.
Yeah,
And
so he's absolutely right.
so, yeah, and maybe we're already at the beginning of it. And you mentioned
So,
China, and we haven't really talked about China's involvement in the whole, like, picture, for lack of a better term. I don't know what to call it, but they're already active in Europe. They've got submarines and ships cruising in the Baltic together with the Russian fleet. cutting sea cables as well along the way. That was apparently a private vessel that was Chinese operated. But like, what's their role and involvement? Like, why would they even partake in those, like, let's call them terrorist attacks almost? Already, is that just to
I
show, hey,
mean,
we're still here, we're here as well?
first of all, on the submarine cables, it's not proven that it was they that actually did cut them. I have no information on that at all. But what what is clear is that for the last 10 odd years, quietly, China has been preparing for global conflict, rebuilding the PLA. In the last couple of years, several private sector factories have had to allocate floor space for the production of PLA goods. Just in the last week or so, Taiwan is saying we have never seen such a large fleet of naval vessels surrounding us since 1996. I think I have no idea if there will be an invasion of Taiwan, but it may well be part of the build-up of China's um, resistance to Trump's introduction of tariffs. You do this, we're going to do that.
I was just looking up, like, by 2035, the People Liberation, or the PLA, Army Navy, will have 435 or 475 ships in 2035, while the U.S. is looking at 305 and 317. So there's definitely a race happening. I was curious, like, how that all will build out. So they're becoming the next superpower, quite literally.
There's no question about it. I mean, they are the manufacturing hub of the world. Just look at the stats.
Yeah, just shipbuilding capacity in China is what
Yeah,
is it,
yeah, yeah,
230
yeah,
times greater than the U.S.
yeah, yeah.
Before we like get lost in the details here, India's role is really interesting. I chatted with Alistair McLeod yesterday, and I'm trying to place India in the whole BRICS scenario. It feels like they're swinging both ways. They want to appease the West. They're playing nice with the East. Where do you put India, Simon?
By the way, Alistair is a good friend of mine, but I've not spoken to him about India. Um, India's playing its foreign policy the way it has always played it, right back to it ever since independence. But I sense that the strength of India's relationship with Russia, particularly Modi to Putin, and then Modi to Xi, that India is quietly putting its more of its eggs into the BRICS camp. Now, this is something that America is going to do its best to stop. I'm told that something is building up in Bangladesh that's going to cause Modi big problems. I don't know what it is, but I've been alerted, just watch out for Bangladesh. So again, America is going to use its toolbox to try to break Modi away from BRICS. So it's part of what one might call a dying empire, using what assets it has left to retain its hegemony.
Interesting. I just typed in India, Bangladesh into Google, and first few articles is India is losing Bangladesh to China and Pakistan, and it could get worse. This is the first headline I see. And that's an opinion piece out of the India Today. So that was
Oh,
the first.
good.
So really interesting.
Well, I'll have to Google the same thing.
Yeah, I just typed in India, Bangladesh to see if, like, curious.
Uh,
I expected historical articles about the breakup and how the border was drawn or anything. Nope, that's the first thing that popped up. So maybe Google knows me too well and knows what we're talking about here. Bit scary, I have to admit, but interesting nevertheless. Maybe one last thing on the BRICS, and we're already running late here. I love our conversation, Simon. The BRICS presidency is with Brazil next year, and you touched on Brazil potentially swaying towards the West here, potential like the U.S. might have or the West might have a stronghold on Brazil right now, or at least have their arms in a twist. What does that mean for 2025 then for the BRICS? Like there were a ton of meetings when Russia had the presidency. I think it was 220. I think I'm quoting Alistair here. 220 meetings when Russia had the presidency, really trying to make a push, trying to be progressive. What do you expect to happen next year with Brazil's leadership?
Consolidation, no growth. I think the other BRICS countries will use 25 to consolidate, start building up their own secretariats, start, instead of the new development bank, which is the BRICS bank, which have been making their loans in dollars, start making them in local currencies. So really, it's a time to consolidate, build up our own internal infrastructures, not a time to expand.
So no new members joining is
No,
more.
I don't think so, no.
Simon, I'm trying to find a topic where we can end on a positive note. Maybe we'll make it a neutral note. But I was going to ask you, I asked you before hitting the record button, like trying to research topics like the Russia-Ukraine situation. Like I struggle with getting unbiased opinions. So I'm asking you, like, where do you get your information? Is there like a website or a blog or a forum where you could send people as like, this is how it actually happened without any biases, politically leaning, like this happened, then that happened without any like commentary there. Just really trying to understand the facts. Like where would you send people?
Well, first of all, I do have private sources. So exclude the private sources. Where you will get really good information is Alistair Crook, Colonel Douglas McGregor, Colonel Wilkinson, and Scott Ritter, and Pepe Escobar. Pepe is phenomenal, Brazilian, but he knows everybody worth knowing in Asia and spends a lot of time in Moscow.
You just provide me with my weekend rabbit holes there, Simon. So that'll be fun. No, I'm looking forward to that. I'll rewatch that part.
And actually, Judge Napolitano on YouTube interviews all of these guys.
Interesting.
And one other I forgot to mention, Larry Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Maybe I'll list them. I'll find their channels and their websites, and maybe I'll list them in the commentary down below as well. So no, that's fantastic information. But maybe I do need to end on a positive note. So what is something positive we can look forward to in 2025, Simon? A positive development.
Second half of next year, economic recovery, equity markets recovering, commodity markets starting to recover, starting a 2-year boom period.
In maybe very last question, Simon. I love chatting with you. That's why these questions keep coming up. But starting in 2028, where would you want to live?
I would want to live where I can grow my own food, I can generate my own electricity, and where I have a ready water supply, not dependent upon the state.
Is there an ideal location for that?
Everybody has their own view of that. But those are the priorities that I would be looking for.
Let's wrap it up here, Simon. What a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. Like, SimonHunt.com is the website where we can find more of you and get in touch with you. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kai.
Merry Christmas, Simon. It's always a pleasure. All the best for 2025. I know we'll catch up in the new year, soon in the new year, maybe right after the inauguration. Like I've been chatting with, I think it was Alistair actually, about the Roosevelt's New Deal. It feels like at least the first 100 days are going to be quite tumultuous. So I'm sure we'll chat during that period and trying to put things into perspective here. So until then, Simon, all the best. Merry Christmas. Good to see you and everybody else. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. A bit of a different conversation, more geopolitical focused, of course. Just trying to put things into context. It means a lot to me. It's like I'm trying to understand what is happening in the world because it does shape financial markets, and that's why the macro is really, really important. If you enjoyed this conversation, a free way to support our channel is just by hitting that like and subscribe button. It helps us out tremendously. It means a lot to us. Leave a comment down below, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much. Merry Christmas. All the best for 2025. We'll be back with lots more in the new year. Thank you so much for joining us.